This video is going to be a site consult video. I don't normally film them, but this one's slightly different. But I'm actually not in Scotland, I'm actually currently in the US, in Virginia. I was brought out for a much larger consultancy job, actually at the adjoining property, so more or less the same site. But for obviously privacy concerns, I'm not going to film that. There's a possibility I could be coming back at a later stage to maybe work on some of those systems. If so, I'll probably film that. But at this stage, you know, that's entirely their baby. It's their site plan, and I'm not filming that. However, the place I'm staying at, my hosts, also are having a consult done, and they're entirely comfortable with all being filmed. So as we have a walk around and basically point at stuff and talk about it, we're going to be just pointing the camera and going. They're going to be ending up with their own YouTube channel as the system's playing. We're just down the road from Langley here, so there's a lot of activity. Anyway, yeah, as the system starts to come in, again, I'm likely to be back, you know, working on some of these systems, as well as they'll have their own YouTube channel, hopefully by then. So yeah, I thought it was a good opportunity to actually get some filming done in a way that I don't normally film consultation work. So yeah, let's have a walk around. So in terms of context, the overall site is 20 acres. This side of it we're concerned with today is more 10 acres. It's, let's think we're in zone 8. It's so difficult to compare with the UK and the US climate zones that don't really work comparably, because on paper it's similar to where, in fact, we're zone 7/8, so it's, you know, comparable. In reality, the Highlands and this, completely different climates. But in terms of tree species, there's a certain amount of overlap. I'm not the best on the specific tree species for here. I don't do a great deal of international consultancy for this reason. Seriously, who does? But there's enough here that I'm familiar with that we can work with, because it's similar enough. It's 38 inches of rainfall a year, so plenty of water. Traditional use of this land, of course, if we go back before colonialism, it would have been, this would have been a largely water-based landscape with beaver dams. There's a lot of water because there's very thin topsoil. So there's only a couple of inches of topsoil. Below that is clay. There's two types of clay on site. There's like a reddish type of clay that would make really nice terracotta. It's really nice. And there's a black clay that is sticky. This stuff is beautiful for pond making, but we could puddle either and make ponds. So instead of it being something, when it rains heavily, you can see the track is fairly close to the level of the soil. What happens is the water builds up on the soil and everything gets wet. The trees themselves, this is climax canopy trees. Over time, over subsequent generations, they will get a little bit taller each time, potentially, but generally we've hit the point that some of the older trees are starting to die back. What was a very diverse natural woodland and forest has actually started to simplify as a lot of the trees start to die off. It's basically simplifying to predominantly white oak, red oak, and hickory. So all productive in terms of nut species, the hickory in particular, but it's starting to greatly simplify. So really it's entering the stage that it needs more management, but very sympathetic management. It's still predominantly, the context of both sides of this site really is still to be ecosystem function, to increase biodiversity, because really, I mean, it's farmland all around. This is a little block of forest in the middle of it all. So there's a huge amount of biodiversity. I mean, the bird life's incredible. So yeah, over time, as trees die off, we've got the potential to, so for example, let me think, south is effectively that way. So north in that direction. So as trees start to die, so say a tree off along that border, you can actually see the border there, a large tree dies. We could let just one of the understory trees, and you can't see them at this time of year because the leaves are down, but there's hundreds of them just fighting, waiting for their opportunity at the light. This is a thick, dense canopy in summer when the trees are in. So by the time a tree dies and everything gets a shot at the light, everything grows like crazy. At that point, be it because a tree is dying, we can either come through and we can harvest it and take it for firewood or mushroom logs or whatever, take whatever yield we want for it, or we can let it intentionally die on the stump and just let it do its thing for ecosystem functions. So you've got all of the entire system of insects moving into it, and then woodpeckers and so on coming through, and then the next stage of decomposition occurring, and then of course as it hits the next forest floor, even more. You need a certain amount of that just for a healthy forest, but we can take a yield from that, or we can leave it standing. The canopy will still be freed up, and into that we can plant something that's actually something that's diverse from what's here, but also something that's more productive. So the obvious one, this is basically the foothills of Appalachia. The obvious choice is chestnut. Now, this area hasn't had chestnut trees in the landscape for a very long time, since blight started wiping them out, and then the government basically came in and wiped out the rest. So there are chestnut blight resistant species starting to be available now. They're typically crossed, I think, with the Chinese chestnuts, and there's only some of the breeding programs are having a certain amount of success, but there's potential there. So chestnut is the big one, because that was one of the main tree species that built this landscape. I'd also start at the same time putting in another story of something like hazel, or under the hickory as things start to die back. Say a tree goes next to a hickory, I would go and actually build a hickory guild underneath that with things like pawpaw and other juglone tolerant species, and start creating a bit more of a diverse system. But this is interesting because it's quite a long track up to the main road, so all the way down this is something that's passed 2-3 times a day sometimes. It's a really well, closely followed area. So if we had productive species all the way down both sides, every time you drive in, it's a straight run. It doesn't take any attention. You can, even going down to get the mail in the morning, you're observing what's here. You can see what's ready for harvest, what might need your attention. And yeah, you can see here just how close the water is to the surface. So, the capacity for creating like vernal pools, just deepening that by several inches would make a huge difference. So if we put a whole series of them dotted around the place at different depths and different heights, and we could connect them with pipe monks, because the whole site slowly slopes in this direction. It's difficult to see because it's not much of a slope. It's really nice, and a slight slope in this direction from this side. So from halfway through that block, it slopes in this direction. So it'd be very easy to have very subtle differences in the height of the ponds and have them trickling down through it. As we go further up the track, there's a few places where there's pipes that run underneath, so we can use those areas with the existing infrastructure, so we haven't got to go digging up the track at all. So we can have water infiltrating, trickling down through the system, cascading then, and finally going down through the pipe, and then we can have a similar system further down. Now we need to be careful with that because access is really important. Whenever you start putting in things like water systems, first off, you're going to have wetter soils in that area, but also, of course, you've got trouble with, you can't get equipment in, flooding, yeah. So you need to have the capacity for that to overspill and be, safely used. Yeah, not go onto the road, but also not go anywhere near the house. You want to direct that completely away. The house is actually on a slight rise. It's beautiful. It's perfect. But you can see just how high the water is. So we can take that water away really passively, really easily. I suppose the nearest culvert is quite a way up. We could put a small one through if we needed to, but we'd have to tie it into, rather than just have it discharged straight to the woods that side, we'd have a couple of small retention ponds for it to slip into. But the culverts are big. They can take major rain events. They're not going to get stuck. They're not going to get jammed up with leaves or anything because they're just so big. And currently it isn't a problem, so it shouldn't be an issue. But it's really nice. So we have to do this sort of thing at this time of year because in just a few months you won't be able to see across this land. So you won't be able to see contour, you won't be able to see level, you won't be able to see anything at all. No. So, it's a jungle. Yeah, which brings to the next point, which is management of that. A lot of these understory species are invasives. I can see there's a rose just coming through there. That's an invasive. There's a number of ground cover species that are also invasives. So the overall site client, one of their objectives, one of their things considering is bringing in small-scale goats like a pygmy goat just to graze some of those out. Another possibility is cooney pigs. They do really well, especially in this habitat, because we've got the oak and we've got the hickory, and we've got the potential for things like chestnut and other nuts coming through as well, which are like the ultimate long-term carbohydrate bearing crop. Chestnut trees are incredible. So this being effectively, so you can always look at the site, right? So if we see that south, this border running all the way down that line, and the one across the back are effectively two great big, huge arms sticking out, framing south, where solar gain is in winter. We could have an understory of evergreen species, just to give a certain amount of privacy, because neighbours are fairly close, even though it's a big block of land. It's still a fairly semi-rural kind of environment. So we could have an understory of evergreens running under it, things like holly and so on. We could even just transplant a lot from within this block. There's a lot of it in here. And we could have an overstory of chestnut trees. So those big, huge trees aren't going to cause any sort of shade issues in winter, even with the trunks, and not come through clear cut and plant them, but just as trees naturally die back and they're harvested. So as they're harvested, we just swap them out. So instead of, we're not coming through and we're taking trees down, we're just intentionally planting where clearings exist. And it might take even an entire generation for these strips of chestnuts to come fully, into fully being planted up. It's because we're talking about very careful management. This is a really nice balanced ecosystem currently. We don't want it to come through with, great big boots and trampling all over everything, imposing our will on the landscape. We're talking about small transitions. So here, for example, you can see you might not be able to see too much of it on camera, but there's a really nice slope just coming down from the back of the site down to this corner where the culvert is. You can just see the little bit of galvanized metal coming through there. There's a couple of spots up in there that'd be really nice areas for creating just very small clay berms and create really small retention ponds and have them cascading up, so that we've got that oversplitting down to the existing low spot there. So really that's almost a couple of days with a spade. It's not even huge. So you've got, it doesn't require heavy machinery, so we're not going in and damaging trees with it. It can be very sympathetically done, but you've got then the sort of space that for 9-10 months of the year, even here, will hold water and hold it late enough into the year so that all of the newts and the frogs have done their thing, because there's a lot of potential biodiversity in that area for those species on this particular site, because there's quite a little bits of pieces of water around the place. But in the wider landscape, there's very little of it, which is why this environment here is so critical, that it's protected, to the degree that it is. So what I'm proposing on mostly, in this more sort of zone 3, zone 4 sort of areas, is very sympathetic, small scale water retaining earthworks between the trees, and then a slow transition over to more productive species to increase biodiversity. Birds are amazing. Increase the diversity of the species on site while retaining what's already here, and do it over the period of perhaps even 2 generations, little bit at a time. So slowly transforming the site sympathetically, so little bit at a time. One of the big advantages of the house layout is the fact that the front of the house faces broadly east, broadly south. So we've got that nice solar gain in winter. Right. On the Highlands, I've got to make sure that I've got really low stuff out there, because the low winter sun is so low. I mean, this is Virginia, we're a lot further south. We haven't got those concerns, but probably some of the larger trees that are up behind the camera, really big full height trees, as they slowly die off naturally and go through succession, I'd suggest planting slightly shorter ones there, just so we get maximum solar gain, so that the whole plan is eventually to have a greenhouse placed against the south side of this for solar gain. Over time, and this is something that could be done in stages, as windows need replacing, just through being, they just need, the seals go in them and they need swapping out anyway, it'd be relatively simple at that point to just take out the block work below, put big doors through, glazed doors, into the greenhouse in the front. Especially because we've got this nice paved area, the greenhouse on the south side of a building is permaculture classic. But the way it used to be done traditionally was you just have a greenhouse with plants growing. The trouble with that is, in warm conditions, in most environments, you've got that moisture being constantly released to the air. That goes into your house, it condenses, and it rots your house. So you've got a really nice rotting house with a beautiful greenhouse attached. It's not ideal. In terms of solar gain, what you're better off dealing with is having something like a solid floor with nice tile in it or whatever. And you can still grow plants in it, but they're in pots, they're in wicking beds, they're in things like that. So you haven't got that constant transpiration from the subsoil up, and you're not creating a tropical rainforest, especially in this environment, within your house. It's deadly. So if we've got a solid floor, we're good. So we can grow plants in the raised beds of an aquaponics system and so on. We can set back the tank, even if we wanted to, back into the room itself. So we've got a really beautiful tank with koi and all the rest of it. And we could use koi for sale, as well as we could have some edible species. And then we can have the beds out here doing their thing. We can have them feeding, I think the probably biggest innovation in aquaculture recently has been dual root zone aquaponics systems. With those, you can have the best of both worlds. It's not as intensely managed necessarily. It's a beautiful system. So this should eventually be a glazed in greenhouse, completely secure from the outside, accessible from the house. It's effectively an extension of the house into the outdoor living and growing space. Huge amount of warmth coming in winter, which reduces the overall energy requirements of the house itself. It's just absolutely gorgeous. I'd keep it open to that side just so we got access around moving forward. But I mean, this is a big greenhouse in here. You can grow a huge amount of food, as well as it just massively extends your living space, and it gives you that indoor and outdoor interaction that's really, really nice. We've also got the potential to do effectively the same on this section here. And again, same thing. We can open that up to the house itself. So we've got that interaction going on. And it's, yeah, really, really beautiful space. Really nice. And then because this doesn't face true south, this face of the house here faces pretty much southeast. So in the morning, you get a lot of sun into this side of the building, and the windows that you can see on this side look into the rooms inside. That'd be really nice to have that morning sun in. Really important, nice, especially in winter, you get that sun coming in. So this again would be really nice with a glazed structure onto the outside of it to enclose it and really increase the effective living space of the building, whilst also creating a huge amount of ecosystem function. Now, the clients want to have a she shed out here. The original plan was to have that facing parallel with this track that I'm standing on. We now think, having had a chat about the solar angles and what we really want from the situation, we're going to twist that 90 degrees. So now it'll run effectively in this direction, so that we get the long side that we can put windows in, and we can get that nice solar aspect in. We could even put a little greenhouse against the south side of that if we wanted to. See, there's a theme here. It's all about solar gain. While we're at it though, we want to leave this area here exactly as we might enhance it, but this will always remain a bed because for personal reasons. And it'd be nice to do something to enhance that. Because we've got this really nice slope coming down here, it'd be fairly simple to dig down. And remember, we've got this much topsoil and then we're into solid clay. So we can remove the topsoil from this area, take that aside. And again, this wouldn't even require big machinery. A small digger would be good, but it could even be done by hand in a couple of weeks. Remove a certain proportion of clay, we put that to the south side, on the downhill slope. We can pack that around as a berm. We can incorporate existing trees because it's a natural clay lined pond. Because we've got this building here, which is the garage, and we've got the house behind, we've got a lot of runoff. So we've got a lot of potential for water coming into this space, and we can have a really nice pond system. Now, we wouldn't have the water running straight off all of these structures and then through the pond, because that's how you end up with a really algae filled pond. You need to have that water available to top up the water that's there, not flow through it. But that's easily done with pipes and so on, and have that water flow off further down the landscape, where you can see it's the really nice slope for integrating more ponds and so on further down. But it means because of the layout, we've got the view from the house out. We've got a really nice pond system here. We've got the she shed here, which will be a nice workshop space for artistic projects. Got a nice tree overhead, so we've got nice overhead shade in the summer. That could even be swapped out. If we put a sapling in of something that was more productive, like a nice, I don't know, like a cherry tree or something like that, as this ages out and starts to dwindle, we can, you know, have that come through instead. You've got so many options, and then you've got a nice pond with a cherry tree over it. It'd be beautiful. It'd be a fairly sheltered and protected space, but also because of the relatively high winter sun angle, that sun bouncing off the surface of the water, we can have a pretty significant water body out here with very little digging because of the lay of the land and the way it flows. So that effectively acts as like a bit of a reflector, and we get more sun bounced into the she shed, and we can have that with a certain amount of thermal mass inside it, so it heats it up, so it just equalizes those temperatures out a little bit. But also on this side of the she shed, then more opposite the house, we could put another simple pond in, and be a slightly more formal, slightly more managed pond. So we could put a rubber line pond and still have it as an ecosystem pond, but have a very simple airlift pump running directly from a solar panel, because it doesn't have to run 24/7, that's fine, just to keep the water turning over. So we could even have some productive species growing in the wetland filter for this pond, and just have it trickling over, so that from the view from the house, as you come out, is you've got the nice she shed behind it, but you've got this really nice raised formal pond that you can see from the house. So you've got that beautiful view, even though effectively you're still looking out over a track, but you won't see it because your eyes will be drawn beyond it, and you've got the greenhouse tucked up against the house just for solar gain. And we've also got the option of using that for solar kiln, so we can bring firewood that needs finishing off into that just to finish off with that little bit of intense sun. So we're on the back side of the house now. North is behind me. This, although it's pretty light today because the leaves are just starting to bud out, the trees overhead mean that this is in deep shade most of the year, but it's still well within zone 1. The house is directly behind the camera that's currently being filmed from a deck, so there's a lot of time spent at the back side of the house, and there's a lot of, with the nice views out, over this area here. So it's a nice area currently. You've got the nice views of the woods. But if we're going to be putting the more productive stuff and the more important stuff in closer to the house, I'd suggest that we keep the wood processing and the wood storage facility, tight up against the house. So probably kind of below the camera there in that area, so it's easy to come out from the house, get the firewood and back in. With that in mind, we've also talked about rocket mass heaters. Now, there is a 1980s good quality box stove in the house. It really throws the heat out, but it goes through a lot of, a load of wood. It's really hungry for fuel. Because it's a good one, I'd say a mass heater, whereas when I built mine, I reckon we were looking at about 10% of the fuel consumption we were getting previously and getting better function from it. Here we're probably looking more like a 50-60% increase in terms of efficiency. So you'd probably go through half as much firewood, but you'd be warmer. That's the other thing. You've still got the longer term heat effect. You're not going to wake up cold in the morning. With loads of standing dead oak and so on, it doesn't seem like such an issue, but don't forget that wood still has to be cut, it still has to be split, it still has to be processed. Eventually, as trees die out in the wider landscape and other trees come in instead, you could adopt more of a coppice-based system, so that instead of it being all really big trees waiting for something to die, it'd be more like a European woodland management style in very small areas where we've got open coppice, so we've always got young growth as well. So you're simulating old and new growth to actually increase biodiversity. You've got to be careful with that. There's been too many, let's impose European management onto this landscape. Too much of that went on in the early days in the US, which is why, this land is what it is today, rather than the closed canopy, massively productive nut canopy that it should be. But what we're trying to do is use, the best of techniques from all over the place to recreate the sort of ecosystem that would have been here originally. It was more productive than anything we can do with a wheat field. So we're trying to basically get back to that, but because we haven't got the species that we would have had originally, it's a bit challenging. So that's where, we're using the permaculture design aspects. But to get back to the subject, in the back of the house, this is a perfect spot for, as I say, wood processing. You always get loads of bark drop off and all the rest of it. So you'd end up with a nice big mulch layer of bark out the back here. That would be a nice area that would remain clear from grass in summer. It'd never need mowing. You could have, and of course you've got the option of digging it out as it breaks down and extracting really good fungal dominant potting soil. So when you're planting up trees, you can just come out and just scrape some of this material away. If there was going to be a chicken system or some sort of poultry system, which there's a possibility of, this would be a nice place for the central part of the the wheel and hub style, rotational grazing system for poultry. So from here we could have fencing, permanent fencing or temporary electric fencing, going out into sections of woodland, and we could actually rotate the chickens through, or the ducks or whatever, through blocks routinely, and we can mix that up and change the size of the paddocks depending on the amount of impact we want in any given area, any given time. One type of poultry that's almost certainly going to be coming to site will be guinea fowl. I've had to have 2 ticks dug out of me, so ticks are an issue on site because it's wooded and not much around here is wooded. There's a lot of deer pressure because they come in because they feel safe here. And of course there's no hunting because there's shouldn't be hunting because there's 2 house sites on the property, so there's always people here. Because of that, there's quite a bit of tick pressure. Guinea fowl take out ticks really efficiently, so that's something that's almost definitely going to happen just from a human safety perspective while working in the woods if it's being managed in a slightly more intensive way than it is currently. We've also got, it'd be a lovely position for worm farms. Now we've got, see the leaf litter we've got, there's masses of it. Out in the wider landscape, we don't leave that well alone. There's all sorts of species that live in the leaf litter, including lightning bugs and things like that. It's crucial that they are left undisturbed, but the stuff immediately around the house, we can sacrifice that to a degree. We can collect the leaf litter, shred it at the same time. We have the equipment for that on site, and that, when it's been gone through like a 6 months to a year composting sequence, is the perfect material for worm farms. Makes amazing worm castings, but it also is a good starter stage for mixing with other material to make really good compost for growing food. So all of that could go on back here. Decent scale worm farms, and of course, as well as being able to have those worm castings to grow food on site, if you've got enough material and if you've got poultry, you've got nuts falling from the trees, both in terms of fats and proteins and carbohydrates that you can feed those poultry without having to buy feed. And you've got soil carbon in terms of wood chip. You combine those things together in any system, and what you're doing is you're creating incredible material that makes beautiful compost or makes really good worm castings. And then you've got a commercially viable, stable product that's as good as it gets for sale. You've actually got an enterprise that can be built up from something that you're doing anyway, with minimal work from materials that the site provides easily. They don't take a huge amount of processing, and it can all be done right here on site, and then stroll back inside and put your feet up in your hammock for a few hours. It's money earned on site is worth double money earned off site, because going out to work is expensive, and traveling to and from work is expensive, both in terms of money, in terms of the clothing stuff that you have to buy, and also just in terms of time. It's a life suck. So that's another possibility out the back here. And the other big one, of course, with a tree landscape, is mushroom log cultivation. There's huge scope for that here. And of course, out the back here, being at this time of year, it's not dark, it's perfectly nice, it's really pleasant, but before it really starts to heat up, we've got closed canopies, so we're back into the shade, keeping mushroom logs moist and cool and alive and at a stable temperature is really easy in this landscape. So you could be literally looking out from the house, having a cup of coffee, and while you just literally stood there having your morning coffee, looking out, you don't think you're achieving a great deal. You've checked your mushroom logs. Oh, that one looks like it might start in a pin. Oh, I need to check that fence there for the chickens. The chickens look well. I can see them scratching around out there. Compost system looks good. Oh, they're starting to get a bit full on the worm farms. I need to, harvest some of them out the bottom today. All of that's happened. You've observed 6 different permaculture systems. You haven't even left your house yet. The more of your zone 1 really key system functions that you've got visible from the house, so you can observe them easily, the better. If you've got to go far away from the house to deal with it, it's less effective. So in terms of annual veg production, it's too dark back here, but there are options to the south side of the house. So where we were talking about the greenhouses on that side of the house, as the trees transition to slightly lower species over the next generation, you could easily expand that out into the other side of the glass there. You could easily expand that into some nice raised beds. So again, as you walk to and from the front door, you're passing them, you're seeing them. As you're driving up, you're seeing them. You could even do the same thing along the main driveway down, so that over the next 30, 40 years, as trees mature and are harvested or taken out for safety reasons, we can replant with other species that are slightly further back, and we could even plant into raised beds all the way down the track if we wanted to, because they're seen multiple times a day. The other way to go with that, of course, would be in this climate with plenty of rainfall, plenty of wood, is hugels. We could easily put relatively big or any size really hugel mounds up and down that driveway, and that way you see them every time you come in. Speaking of hugel mounds, that's the next system we're going to look at. So before we go further back into the system, you see over here there's a massive oak tree down. The top of it's been taken for fuel, but the main trunk is beyond. It's the perfect example of the sort of thing. I mean, you could run mushrooms on a log that size for years. You know, you could pull kilos and kilos and kilos of mushrooms out of it. It's good for years. It's an amazing resource. So you're growing food on just a bigger time, a longer timeline. I mean, we're talking about doing mushrooms, but it's on pretty small material because it's a very young system. This is the opposite of that. So as we're getting further from the house, we're not going to be going for the systems that require a huge amount of maintenance because it's further from the house. Now, if at any point in the future someone decided to stick a tiny house and move on to site or whatever, down into this clearing now is one of the obvious places, which is why we need to keep the side next to the house clear rather than connected up to the garage, because that's the main access coming through. So this is the obvious place for a further house site. We've got really good access coming in. More importantly, we've got solar access because it's close canopy forest apart from the bit that we're directly walking down now overhead and into this clearing. It's a nice site. I mean, you could stick a tiny house or a yurt or a tent or, just have, people camp back here when they're staying on site very, very easily. But also, because it's one of very few areas that we've actually got solar access clear, it's got huge potential. It's a rare thing on this site, unless we're going to take down trees, which we don't want to do, at least not in large numbers. We don't want to make clearings. We want to utilize clearings as they naturally appear to go through succession in the direction that we want. This is a clearing. This is rare on this site. The septic field for the house runs down, and this is where it finishes up, which is why this has been kept clear. We can't have trees in here because the roots would damage all of that. They get in and they massively compromise that, and the whole thing needs swapping out. So what can we do with it? Well, a lot. Currently, it'd be more like a zone 3. It's something that's, visited once a week or so while out, walking the dogs this way or whatever. But it's a perfect location for putting in hugel mounds. Now, we've got a skid steer on site, so we've got access to heavy machinery just for moving material around. Certain people are such advocates of hugel mounds, they advocate them in every single situation. Everyone should definitely use them. I'm a bit more conservative than that with them. They're great in a situation where you've got huge amounts of wood biomass and where you've got equipment on site. If you're having to, because the original hugel mounds that were popularized were done so by Sepp Holzer. They're the most famous hugel mounds, in the world. He has heavy equipment in terms of tractors with buckets and so on, because you've got to rebuild these things periodically, every 6, 10, 15 years, depending on the size of them and the amount of material you're putting into it and the size of those logs. They need building periodically. If you're doing stuff by hand like I have to on my site, that's just not feasible. And of course, I've planted 10,000 trees. I've got, I haven't got big trees yet. The last thing I'm going to be doing if I'm cutting them down is, putting them rot in the ground. That's my fuel. So we don't have excess wood. We don't have it in the wider environment. We do here. So we've got heavy equipment and we've got wood and we've got nice fertile soil. Hugel mounds are the obvious choice. I wouldn't put any large shrubby species that are too big onto the mounds in here, because again, we don't want to go down too low and risk getting into the septic field. But long-lived perennial crops like Jerusalem artichokes and so on, beautiful. You can grow on the topper edge of it. You could even basically create a situation that's perfect for more perennial stuff like strawberries and so on. That'll be fairly simple to do on those sort of systems. Really nice systems. And of course, if anyone did end up with a house site back here living, this then becomes their zone 1. And it'll be very easy to transition those mounds at that point through to something that's intensely managed for annual vegetables, because you've got this amazing clear sky. So you've got something that is hugely productive, but also the framework is in place that you could leverage that at any point you wanted in the future into dogs. If you can leverage that at any point you wanted in the future into something that was really productive and could, you know, support an individual or a couple or a small family living here on this spot. But you can see the trees around, and you can see the way that the land slopes away. So again, even here, if you did have a structure, of course, that someone was living in, that structure would have 100% runoff of water. That has to go somewhere. Because we got the slope, it'd be really simple to put a small series of berms in, and you could have a little cascading pond section that took that water away, and again increases, you know, all the biodiversity and all the rest of it. And of course, in the UK, we don't have this, but here you've got frogs that actually croak audibly at night. It's awesome. Step outside the back door and you've got all this croaking. You know, it's normal here. It's exotic as hell to me. It's brilliant. So yeah, it's really nice. And of course, with this being open, it keeps, you're not living in the deep woods, which really you need to live in clearings here. As I say, ticks are a bit of a problem. Solar access is nice, but also there's the chiggers. And I've got chiggers in places I don't want to mention on camera. So I got opinions about chiggers. But anyway, moving on. So yeah, the site itself is a huge resource. You can see these leaves here are the stuff that's come through the shredder. So you can see just how good this material is. I mean, give this 6 months and this is absolutely perfect for a worm farm. Oh, that was a stone. Something moved in my hand. Yeah, that's why I was a bit careful. But yeah, so you can see, I mean, it's amazing resource. Everything that this site needs is virtually, you know, right here on site. Because we got the clay, we'd have to think about sand, but there's plenty of that nearby. We'd need to think about some sort of fibre, but other than that, we got perfect clay for making cob. I've run a few tests on it with the jars. It's amazing material, and because we've got the two types of clay, we've got the capacity to make two different colours of cob, so we can make really beautiful buildings. We've got oak, so we can make all the shakes that we need for roofing. We can make all the beams that we need on site. We can make incredible, beautiful buildings, other than, I don't know, maybe a little bit of metal hardware and some glass. Other than that, we can make an entire building right here on site that would last for generations. This site is incredible.
And don't forget about the fox den.
Fox den, yeah. We'll come and have a look at this. We'll cut, but come and have a look at this. So this is a fox den, and we're not very far from the house. We're very close to where we were just filming. It's an extensive system, and it's been here for generations. But actually, it's a pretty good example of showing you what the soil's like. I mean, this is the clay that we got, and this is fairly dry. I'd rather, you know, if I was going to be doing a true clay test, I'd have a lot of. It's really nice. This could be compacted really readily. See how it's clinging together? It's beautiful clay. It's very dry, so it's not doing the clumping thing, but it's really nice. And this, of course, is fairly dry soil because it's, you know, up on this berm. But it just illustrates that the wildlife on this site is extraordinary. The diversity is amazing because it's unique. There's nothing like it in miles of this sort of scale. So there's a lot more life comes in and out of here, including the predators. And you might say, well, they'd have to go for bringing chickens in here. Well, not really. If we make, you know, there are predators in this landscape. There's going to be predators in this landscape. There've always been predators in this landscape. If we bring livestock in that we need to be concerned about for their safety, that's something we need to address, and we need to be concerned with their safety, and we need to build that into the systems. So on this site, for example, we'd have them, most of the predators are really active at night. So that would be a concern. So we'd have a central system that the animals come back to safely at night. During the daytime, they can go out and stay within fenced areas that it's easy to control with a good hot spark. You know, get really good netting options these days. That's what we use on the croft. And we got, not on the same scale here, but, you know, obviously we do have predator pressure there. But really, it shouldn't be an issue because they've always got plenty to eat. If something like a fox becomes an issue, then we'll deal with that individual fox. What we don't do is come in and just eradicate all the foxes from a landscape, because the predator and pest pressure is a balance on a landscape. And if you start coming in and you start messing that around, you're going to have difficulties in other systems. it needs to be able to manage itself in balance, and that includes predators. And it's only logical that predators are going to be present here on this site because it's so biodiverse. They're not going to live elsewhere where it's much more hostile for them and then come and hunt here, because they're going to be here. You will always have predators in an ecosystem this rich. So you might as well just accept that they're here and know what you're dealing with. It's really nice to see, because this is an active fox colony. It's really nice. And, you know, it's just not been an issue. And we're recording.
We're recording. Hey y'all, we're Don and Annie Tennyson. We've just moved to Virginia area. We've got 10 acres of land that we've kind of inherited, that we're taking over. It's got a house on it. And it's forest land, 10 acres of forest land, and it's beautiful land. It's full of oak, poplar,
Sweet gum,
pine,
cedar,
all kinds of different genres.
walnut.
Some walnut, yeah. Anyway, with all that being said, is that we're on a limited income, limited budget, and there's enough resources here that we want to do something with the place. So we have a friend of ours who gave us some great ideas and recommendations on developing our place to make it more livable for us and sustainable, and the ability to grow.
And use the resources that we have to be productive, because this is my family land. This is where I grew up. This is my childhood home. I never saw myself being back here. But as it is one of the only forested areas in this whole area, because it's been developed into oblivion with McMansions, I want to protect it and I want to preserve it. We have rare species here, like the cranefly orchid. We have rare frogs. We have newts. We have salamanders. We have box turtles. The wildlife here is incredible, and because we are the only remaining forested area, it is almost a preserve, and so we want to keep it that way.
In fact, we've got a den over here of it's a fox den, burrowed into the ground, where
It's
right
an
here on
apartment
property.
building.
Yeah, it's an apartment
It's
building.
a fox apartment building.
Okay.
So we will work around them.
So it sounds like you could definitely be making a YouTube channel on these subjects.
Probably.
We will be.
We will be.
And that's the whole point of this, is to show the growth and the changes that we're making in the property to make it more sustainable and more productive for us, and utilizing the existing woods and the
natural resources.
Existing natural resources to make it more viable and productive for us, but at the same time being close with nature and not destroying it, like going in and clear cutting trees. We want to do select cutting. There's, right now the way things are, it's overgrown. It's been an unmanaged forest for a few years, and it's time to make some changes. And as these older trees die out, we have plans of coming back and planting chestnuts and bringing them back to some more fruit
We're going to reach
producing.
out to
Dolly.
the chestnuts that Dolly is propagating. See if we can get some seeds from Dolly's American Chestnut Program, because it's the perfect environment here. It's very similar to Gatlinburg, where that is currently going on. So, want some chestnuts.
We'll grow native. Yep. So, good. So, come see us. YouTube.